The first time my own son told me I was no longer welcome in my company, he did it in front of 12 employees, 2 board members, and the woman he was cheating on his wife with. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood at the head of the long glass conference table in our downtown Dallas office, straightened his cufflinks, and looked at me like I was a problem he had finally decided to solve. "Dad," he said, with that cold, polished smile I had seen him use on customers and bankers. "Effective immediately. You're being relieved of all duties. Security will escort you out." For a second, nobody moved. I looked around the room, at the faces I had hired, trained, and fed for years. Some of them stared down at the table. One woman had her hand over her mouth. My son's assistant would not meet my eyes. And there, sitting beside Evan, in a red dress that looked too expensive for a morning meeting, was my daughter-in-law's best friend, Vanessa, pretending she belonged there. I heard the words, but they didn't make sense. "Excuse me?" I said. Evan didn't flinch. "You heard me," the board voted. "Dad, you've been underperforming for years. The company needs fresh leadership. It's time." I almost laughed. Almost. Because the irony was so thick, it could have choked the whole room. I had built Mercer Equipment Supply from a rented storage unit and a second-hand pickup truck. I had worked 70-hour weeks while Evan was in Little League and later through his college years and every single crisis our family ever faced. I had signed the loans, taken the risks, skipped vacations, and swallowed pride so my son could inherit something bigger than the life I started with. And now he was firing me like I was an old appliance he had finally decided to replace. I stood there in my Navy suit, the one my wife had bought me before she died, and looked at my son. "You're serious," I said. His jaw tightened. "This isn't personal." That was the lie that made my hands shake. Because betrayal is always personal. Security appeared by the door, awkward and stiff. They were both good boys, barely old enough to shave, and I knew they didn't want to be here. One of them kept glancing at me, as if hoping I would explode and make this easier for him. But I didn't explode. I just nodded once. "Okay," I said quietly. That seemed to bother Evan more than if I had shouted. He narrowed his eyes. "That's it?" I picked up my leather briefcase from the chair, slid the old brass fountain pen into my pocket, and looked him straight in the face. "You'll understand soon enough." He let out a humorless laugh. Understand what? That the company finally belongs to people who know how to run it? There it was. Not just arrogance, hunger. The kind of hunger that grows in a man who thinks what he sees is all there is, who mistakes silence for weakness, who believes the person he's pushing out has no more power left. I walked past him without another word. At the elevator, one of the board members, Harold Pike, caught up to me. Harold was 58, with a carefully arranged face and a way of talking that always made him sound concerned even when he was lying through his teeth. "Tom," he said softly, "this isn't what it looks like." I laughed under my breath. "Harold, it looks exactly like what it is." He glanced back at the conference room door and lowered his voice. "Just go home. Let things calm down." "Calm down?" I repeated. He didn't answer. That told me everything I needed to know. By the time I stepped out into the Texas heat, my phone was already buzzing with texts, old employees asking if I was all right. One from my accountant, one from my attorney, and one from my grandson, Caleb, who was only 17 and had no idea his father had just picked a fight with a man who had spent 40 years learning how to survive worse. I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine. I should tell you something now, because it matters. Evan didn't know I owned 51% of the shares, and he didn't know why. That part of the story begins 26 years earlier, on a rainy night when my wife, Mary Ann, was still alive and our company was still small enough to fit inside my head. Back then, Mercer Equipment Supply was nothing but a gamble. We sold and repaired industrial parts to construction crews, warehouses, and manufacturing plants across North Texas. Nothing glamorous. Just honest work, long days, and grease under the fingernails. I started with almost nothing. My father had died with debt. My mother cleaned motel rooms. Marianne worked part-time at a pharmacy while raising Evan and balancing the books for my little business from our kitchen table. That woman was my anchor. When I wanted to give up, she pushed me forward. When banks turned us down, she found another one. When we missed payroll 1 month, she sold her wedding ring and never once made me feel like a failure. And when the company finally started making real money, she said something I never forgot. "Tom," she told me one night while we sat on the back porch listening to the cicadas, "if this company ever gets big enough to split a family apart, promise me you'll protect the family before you protect the business." I remember smiling because I thought she was being dramatic. "I'm not planning to let anything split us apart," I said. She reached over and touched my wrist. "People don't plan it. They just get greedy." Marianne died of ovarian cancer 6 years later. By then, Evan was in his 30s, married to a sweet woman named Claire, and working in the company as my right hand. Or so I thought. When Marianne was sick, Evan stepped up in ways that made me proud. He drove her to appointments. He brought soup. He sat beside her hospital bed when I had to take calls from suppliers and banks. I remember thinking, this is what a good son looks like. This is why I built this life. After she passed, something changed. Maybe grief made him harder. Maybe success did. He started talking like every decision I made was outdated. He spoke about scaling, restructuring, leveraging the brand, bringing in outside investors. He said all the right words in meetings, but under them I could hear the hunger. Then I noticed the little things. Late-night emails to board members I hadn't known he was meeting with. Expense accounts that didn't match his travel logs. A new designer watch that cost more than my first truck. The way Claire's face tightened when she looked at him at family dinners. The way he stopped asking my advice and started waiting for me to make a mistake. I wasn't blind. I just didn't want to see my own son for what he was becoming. The company had grown enough that I took one step back from day-to-day operations and let Evan serve as president. I kept the majority share, though, 51%. That was non-negotiable. Marianne had insisted on it years earlier, after a lawyer explained why control mattered. "Tom needs to stay protected," she had said. "You never know what happens when people start confusing inheritance with ownership." At the time, I thought she was overthinking. She wasn't. Still, I didn't wave that ownership around. I didn't want a crown. I wanted a family. But on the same night I returned home after being escorted out of my own office, I opened the fireproof box in my study, pulled out the old stock certificate, and looked at the document that proved the truth Evan had forgotten. 51%. My name. My signature. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went to the little diner on Main Street where I used to meet truck drivers and suppliers before the company ever had glass walls and expensive coffee machines. I had called my attorney, Marla Jenkins, and asked her to meet me there. Marla was one of the few people in town who could still speak to me like I was a human being instead of a wallet. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, practical, and impossible to impress. She slid into the booth across from me, looked at my face once, and sighed. "Your son fired you," she said. "Your sources are still good. They don't need to be good to know the office gossip. Half the staff saw it." I stared into my coffee. "How bad is it?" Marla folded her hands. "Bad enough that if Evan planned this properly, he assumed you'd fold." I gave a bitter half-smile. "He assumed wrong." She studied me. "Do you want the legal answer or the personal one?" "Both. The legal answer is you still control the company. The personal answer is your son is either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident. Probably both." She leaned forward. "Tom, tell me the truth. Did you know this was coming?" "I knew he was moving pieces. I didn't know he'd do it in a board meeting." "And Claire?" I rubbed my forehead. "I'm not sure what she knows." Marla watched me carefully. "You don't trust her." "I trust her more than him," I said. "But that's not saying much right now." She nodded. "Then let's find out exactly what he's done before you make your move." I should explain, Claire. My daughter-in-law was the kind of woman who made a room calmer just by entering it. Graceful, intelligent, and kind without being weak. She had married Evan when they were both in their late 20s. She worked as a high school counselor before she took over some of the company's community outreach and charitable work. She never acted impressed by money, which is probably why I liked her so much, and maybe why Evan started resenting her. They had one son, Caleb, who was the only person in that family who still laughed from the heart. When I first saw signs that Evan was drifting toward vanity and control, I thought Claire might be the one person who could reach him. I was wrong about that too, at least partly. The truth was more complicated. 2 days after the firing, Claire showed up at my house after dark. Her car was parked down the street instead of in the drive, and she looked like she hadn't slept in a week. I opened the door and said nothing. She stepped inside, wringing her hands together. "Tom, I didn't know he was going to do that to you." I led her to the kitchen. Didn't know or didn't want to know. Her eyes filled with tears. "I told him not to. I told him it was cruel." That got my attention. I looked at her carefully. "What did he say?" "He said you were holding him back, that the company needed to move on." She swallowed hard. "He said you'd never accept it unless he made it happen." I sat down slowly at the table. She rubbed at her eyes. "He's been meeting with Harold Pike and 2 outside investors for months. I think they were planning to dilute your shares through a restructuring deal. He told me not to worry about it, that it was all temporary." "Did you believe him?" She gave a laugh so sad it almost broke me. "No." There was a long silence. Then she said, very softly, "He's not just trying to take the company, Tom. He's trying to erase you from it." That was the moment I knew I had underestimated how far this had gone. I asked her one question. "Why are you telling me this?" She looked down at her ring finger, where the diamond sat untouched. "Because I'm tired of watching him lie to everyone, and because he's not the man I married." Her voice cracked on the last word. I believed her, not because I was naive, but because pain has a way of exposing truth. She went on to tell me things she should never have had to know. Hidden loans, a sweetheart deal with a private equity group in Houston, a proposal to move company assets into a new holding entity controlled by Evan and Harold. My son wasn't just pushing me out. He was building a trap around the whole business. And he had probably expected me to be too angry or too old or too sentimental to fight back. That was his second mistake. The first had been forgetting who taught him everything he knew. Marla called an emergency audit that afternoon. Within 48 hours, we found enough irregularities to make Evan's stomach drop into his shoes if he ever saw them all at once. Reclassified expenses, unauthorized transfers, improperly documented board minutes, a consulting contract with a shell firm that led straight back to one of Harold's cousins. But the biggest problem wasn't the accounting. It was motive. And motive was easy to prove once the right people started talking. I didn't go public yet. I didn't storm back into the office waving papers and shouting. That would have been satisfying, but satisfaction is not the same thing as justice. I wanted the full picture, so I did something Evan would never have expected. I kept quiet. For 1 week, I let him think he had won. The next Monday, I received a formal letter from the company's new legal counsel, informing me that my consulting relationship had been terminated, and that any attempt to enter company property would be considered trespassing. Consulting relationship. That line alone told me everything. In his mind, I had become a contractor, a ghost, a man to be paid off and forgotten. I read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it in my desk drawer. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my banker, a man named Reggie, who had extended credit to me back when my company was barely holding itself together and who still remembered that history mattered. The second was to our outside forensic accountant, a woman named Denise Vaughn, who had once saved me from a tax disaster by catching an error nobody else saw. The third was to Claire. She answered on the second ring, sounding nervous. "Tom, can you meet me somewhere private?" There was a pause. "Yes, tonight." We met at a small park off Lover's Lane after dark, away from downtown traffic. The air was cool, and the lake reflected the lights from the nearby apartments like broken glass. Claire sat on the bench beside me, folding and unfolding her hands. "I found something," I told her. Her face tightened. What? Your husband and Harold are moving money. I think they've been preparing a takeover backed by a shell company. She closed her eyes. You knew, I said. I suspected, she whispered. I didn't know for certain. Why didn't you come to me sooner? That hit her like a slap. Her chin trembled. Because I was afraid. Of him? She looked at me. And in that moment I saw not just fear, but shame. Of what happens when I stop protecting my son, she said. And of what happens when I stop pretending my marriage is still something I can save. I said nothing. She pressed a hand to her mouth. He's changed, Tom. He's angry all the time. He checks my phone, asks where I've been, gets furious if I'm not home when he expects. He says, I'm too soft, too loyal to old people and old ideas. He said you were teaching Caleb to be weak. I turned toward her slowly. He said that about his own son? She nodded. I could feel the anger rising then, hot and sharp, but I swallowed it. Anger clouds judgment. It had already cost me too much. Claire reached into her purse and pulled out a small thumb drive. What's that? I asked. I copied emails from his laptop, she said. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself anymore. I took the drive from her hand. It felt heavier than plastic should feel. Inside were emails between Evan and Harold, discussing a restructuring plan they called Project Renewal. There were draft agreements, instructions to alter ownership records, and one message where Evan wrote, Once he's out, the market will understand this is a younger company now. My father's era is over. Me era. The words stung more than they should have. There was also an email from Harold to an investor in Houston, saying that Tom Mercer would either accept a graceful exit or be forced into one. Forced into one. I stared at the screen printouts for a long time. Claire was crying quietly beside me. I'm sorry, she said. I shook my head. Don't apologize for what he chose. But a part of me was thinking something else then. Evan had made his choice, yes. But choices have consequences. And often the real consequences are paid by people who never got a vote. Caleb was the one who paid the first price. I found out when he came to my house the following Saturday, carrying a duffel bag and looking angry enough to punch a wall. He was taller than his father at 17, with his mother's calm eyes and my stubborn jaw. What's going on? He demanded the moment I opened the door. I frowned. Hello to you too. He stepped inside and dropped his bag by the stairs. Dad says you're trying to destroy the company. I didn't react right away. Did he now? He said you're angry because you got removed from leadership, and now you're stirring up trouble. I studied my grandson's face. He wasn't here for the company. He was here because he didn't know who to believe. Caleb, I said carefully, did your father tell you why I was removed? He crossed his arms. He said you were making decisions without understanding the modern business. I let out a breath through my nose. And do you believe that? He looked away for a second. I don't know. That honesty hurt more than accusation would have. I motioned for him to sit down in the living room. He didn't at first, but he eventually did. Your father fired me in a board meeting, I said. He brought in security and announced it like I was a criminal. Caleb's face changed. No way. Yes way. He wouldn't do that. I reached into a drawer, pulled out the letter from legal counsel, and handed it to him. He read it in silence. Then another piece of paper. Then the email thread Denise had helped me print. At first, his face just looked confused, then pale, then embarrassed. He told me you were being unreasonable, he whispered. Your father has been telling a lot of people a lot of things. Caleb looked up at me, and I could see the whole storm of confusion in him. Why would he do this to you? It was such a young question. Why would a son do this to his father? Why would a husband lie to his wife? Why would someone choose money over blood? Because greed, once it gets a grip on a man, starts rewriting all the rules. I wish I had a simple answer, I told him. But sometimes people decide they're entitled to everything they can reach. He sat very still. Mom knows? Yes. And you're going to stop him? I looked at my grandson, at the fear in his face, and answered honestly. Yes, but it may get ugly first. The ugly part came faster than I expected. 3 days later, Evan and Harold called an emergency board meeting to finalize the restructuring vote. They thought they were closing the trap. Instead, they walked into the jaws of one. I arrived early with Marla and Denise, not as a guest, as a shareholder. When Evan saw me sitting at the table, he froze for just a second before recovering. "Dad," he said, his voice clipped and controlled, "this meeting is for board members only." Marla set a thick folder on the table. Actually, Tom Mercer is the controlling shareholder, and under Section 4.2 of the bylaws, he has a right to attend any meeting involving ownership restructuring. Harold's face went from smug to annoyed in a single blink. "That's not necessary." Denise opened her laptop. "It is when the minutes show undisclosed asset transfers." A silence followed so sharp it seemed to ring. Evan's eyes darted from one face to another. "What is this?" I leaned back in my chair. "It's the part where you remember who owns the majority of this company." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "It doesn't matter," he said. "The board already approved the transition." "Not all of it," Marla replied. "And certainly not with forged documentation." That got everyone's attention. I watched Harold's fingers tighten around his pen. He was trying to calculate escape routes in real time. Evan tried to laugh. "Forged? That's ridiculous." Denise turned her monitor toward him. "Then explain the duplicate timestamps, the altered ownership draft, and the transfer instructions sent to a holding company you never disclosed to the board." He stared at the screen. I could see the first crack appear. Then he recovered enough to sneer. "Even if there were irregularities, you're still the problem, Dad. You haven't been involved in years. The company needs leadership that understands where the market is going." I nodded slowly. "That's true." He blinked, surprised by my agreement. "The company does need leadership," I continued, "which is why I brought in an independent auditor, a bank representative, and the state's corporate compliance council. This meeting is now on the record." That word landed like a brick. "On the record." Harold sat up straight. "You had no right to do that without approval." "I had every right," I said. "As majority owner." Evan's face had gone hard now. "You're trying to humiliate me." "No," I said. "You did that yourself." He stood up so quickly his chair rolled back. "You set me up." I looked at him for a long, sad moment. "No, son. I taught you what integrity looked like, and you decided it was optional." The room was dead silent. Then he snapped. "You always talked like this was your company, even after I spent 10 years keeping it alive." A few of the board members looked uncomfortable. One of them wouldn't meet my eyes. I leaned forward, keeping it alive with whose money, whose guarantees, whose credit, who covered the gap when your expansion failed in 2020, who signed the line of credit that saved your payroll. He said nothing. I went on. "You did work hard. I never denied that. But you built your pride on top of my foundation and then started calling the foundation old." His face reddened. "You treated me like a child." "No," I said quietly. "I treated you like my son." That shut him up for half a second. Then Harold tried to salvage the room. "Tom, let's not make this emotional." I laughed once. "That's funny coming from a man who nearly tanked a 40-year business for a consulting fee." Harold's expression hardened. "You don't understand how things work anymore." I stood up too, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape. "Then, enlighten me." He looked around, saw the cameras, the compliance council, the auditors, and realized too late he was trapped. The company's outside counsel, who had been quietly observing from the end of the table, cleared his throat. "Mr. Pike, we've already received notification of a formal investigation. Any further misstatement will be documented." That was when Harold's face changed. Not fear, exactly. Panic. Because men like Harold can survive suspicion. They can even survive rumors. But paperwork is different. Paperwork has memory. Evan turned to him sharply. "What investigation?" Harold didn't answer. "I did. Into the unauthorized restructuring plan, the unapproved transfer agreements, the consulting contracts, and the financial misrepresentation of corporate performance." Evan stared at me like he'd been slapped. "You don't have proof," he said. Denise rotated her laptop toward him again and tapped the trackpad. I have enough to ask the bank to freeze the line of credit. That hit him harder than the firing had hit me. His eyes widened. You can't do that. I already did, she said. You could have heard a pin drop. I watched my son's face drain of color. He looked around the room, searching for allies, but every person there had finally seen the truth. The king was naked. The crown was paper. The board meeting lasted 23 minutes after that. Harold resigned on the spot once it became clear the investigation would go to the state and to federal auditors if necessary. One of the investors in Houston, when contacted, denied everything and claimed he had been misled. The shell company vanished so fast it was almost comical. Evan tried to fight it, then tried to negotiate, then finally tried to blame Harold outright. But blame is a poor umbrella in a hurricane. By the end of the meeting, the company's counsel had placed Evan on administrative leave pending review, and my voting control had been formally reinstated. I did not smile, not once, because this wasn't victory. It was family wreckage with receipts. The real explosion came later that night. Evan showed up at my house just after 9, unannounced, driving too fast and slamming his car door hard enough to rattle the windows. I opened the front door and found him standing there with his tie loose, his face gray, his anger barely holding itself together. "Did you enjoy that?" he said. I stepped aside and let him in. "No," he laughed, power without patience. He stared at the table. "Tell me the truth," I said. "Was any of this worth it?" His jaw flexed. He didn't answer right away. Then, very quietly, he said, "I thought if I took control, I'd finally matter." That was the worst sentence he could have said, because beneath all his cruelty was the same old wound I had never properly seen. A son who had spent years trying to win a race that no one told him was imaginary. I felt my anger shift, just a little. Not disappear. Not by a long shot, but shift. "Evan," I said, "you mattered long before any of this." His eyes flicked up, wet and startled. "You were my son, my pride, my mistake sometimes, my joy other times, but always my son." He gave a broken laugh and wiped at his face, like he hated himself for showing weakness. "Then why didn't it feel like enough?" he whispered. "There are questions no father can answer perfectly. I could have lied, could have said I didn't know, but that would have been cowardly. I think I loved the company more than I knew how to show I loved you," I said. That landed between us like a dropped glass. Evan looked down. For a moment the room seemed to grow older around us. Then he said the thing I never expected. "I didn't plan for Harold to steal that much. I thought we were just forcing you out, not destroying everything." I exhaled slowly. There it was. The admission. Not innocence. Not exactly. But not pure malice either. "Did you know he was paying himself through those consulting contracts?" I asked. He shook his head. "Did you know about the shell company?" "No." "Did you know about the falsified minutes?" He hesitated. "Evan." "No," he said finally. "Not all of it. That mattered. Not enough to save him from consequences, but enough to keep me from rewriting him into a monster simpler than the man he was." He buried his face in his hands. "I messed everything up." "Yes," I said. He looked up sharply, almost offended by my honesty. Then I softened my voice. "But that doesn't mean you're beyond repair." He let out a bitter laugh. "That sounds generous after everything I did." "It's not generosity," I said. "It's the truth." He sat very still. Then I gave him the one thing he had not expected from me all week. A way back. Not to his position, not to his pride. Back to himself. "You're going to cooperate fully with the investigation," I said. "You're going to tell them everything you know. You're going to face the consequences without blaming anyone else. And you're going to apologize to your mother, your wife, your son, and everyone you dragged into this." This was not the son who had fired me. This was not the polished executive, or the hungry opportunist, or the man who believed entitlement could become destiny if he dressed it well enough. This was a damaged man standing in the open, finally unable to hide behind strategy. "Are you actually sorry?" I asked. "Or are you sorry you got caught?" He took a long breath. "Both, at first," But now I'm sorry, because I can finally see what I did. That was the closest thing to truth I had heard from him in months. I opened the envelope after he left. Inside was a handwritten letter, not polished, not legal, just a son trying, painfully and imperfectly, to speak to a father he had wounded. He wrote about shame, about envy, about how every success in the company had felt to him like proof that he was one step away from being small again. He admitted he had mistaken fear for ambition and control for strength. He said he understood now that I had never been trying to bury him. I had been trying to protect him from the same greed that had already eaten half the people around us. At the bottom, he wrote one sentence that I read 3 times. I don't deserve you, but I still hope one day I can be worthy of being your son. I sat in my chair a long time after that, staring at the letter, until the room went dim around me. Forgiveness is a strange thing. People talk about it like it is one door opening, or one speech forgiving everything. It is not. Sometimes it is a tiny thing, a choice not to harden forever, a refusal to let betrayal become your entire identity. I did not forgive him that night. I'm not going to lie to make the story cleaner than it was. What I did do was call Claire. She answered on the second ring. He wrote to you too? I asked. Yes, she said quietly. And for the first time, I believe he means it. A long silence passed between us. Then she added, Do you ever think we can come back from this? I looked out at the porch where my son had stood, alone and ashamed and maybe finally real. Not back, I said. No, but maybe forward. The company survived. That mattered, though not as much as it would have before. We brought in a new executive team, restructured the debt, and rebuilt trust with vendors and employees, one hard conversation at a time. I spent the next year not chasing growth for the sake of ego, but fixing what should have been fixed long before it broke. I set up a scholarship fund in Marianne's name for employees' children. I updated the family trust. I made sure the voting shares would never again be used as a weapon by anyone who thought inheritance was the same as entitlement. As for Evan, he worked for a nonprofit logistics cooperative in Fort Worth for 2 years, before starting over in a much smaller role at a supplier company, where nobody cared whose son he had been. He sent me quarterly updates I didn't always respond to right away, but I read every one. Claire eventually returned to Texas, though not to him. She and Caleb rented a small house near Plano. She rebuilt her life with the kind of quiet dignity that makes fools feel ashamed of ever underestimating her. Caleb visited me often. He started asking questions about the old days, about the first warehouse, the first sale, the first time I almost went bankrupt. He wasn't asking about money. He was asking about endurance, about character, about the parts of a man that don't show up on a balance sheet. One evening, almost a year after everything fell apart, he sat with me in the garage while I worked on an old transmission in the pickup I'd nearly sold during better years. Do you hate my dad? He asked. The question came out plain. No drama attached. I wiped my hands with a rag and thought about it. No, I said, but I don't trust the man he was. Caleb nodded. Do you trust who he's becoming? I looked at the oil stain on my hand, at the open garage door, at the long road outside our house glowing gold in the late afternoon. I trust change more than excuses, I said. That's how people earn a second chance. He absorbed that in silence. Then he said, Mom said Grandpa taught her that people can break your heart and still be part of your story. I smiled a little. Your mom is wiser than all of us. He grinned at that. That night, after he left, I sat alone in the study and opened the old fireproof box again. The stock certificate was still there, the proof of what had saved me from being erased. 51%? Ownership. Control. For a long time, I thought those things were the point. They weren't. The point was never that I had the shares. The point was that I had the chance, at the worst moment of my life, to decide what kind of man I would be when my own child tried to break me. I could have destroyed him. I could have used the power I had to crush him, humiliate him, make him disappear from the company and the family entirely. There were moments when I wanted to. But vengeance doesn't heal a wound. It only proves you can make one deeper. So I chose justice instead. Not soft justice. Not fake forgiveness. Real justice. The kind with consequences. Harold got exposed. The investors lost their leverage. The company was cleaned out and rebuilt. Evan faced the ruins of his own making and had to live in them long enough to become someone different. And me? I got something I didn't expect. Peace. Not perfect peace. Life never gives that. But enough peace to sit in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, hear my grandson laugh in the other room, and know that the man my son fired from the company was not the man my family could define forever. A year to the day after the board meeting, the same conference room where my son tried to throw me out had a different feel to it. The windows were still the same. The table was still polished too brightly, but the air had changed. The people around it were different now. Honest faces, careful voices, no hidden contracts on the side, no smug board members pretending they were acting in anyone's best interest but their own. I stood at the head of the table and looked at the team we had rebuilt. Then I said the one thing I never thought I would have to say to a room like that again. Before we begin, I want to make one thing clear, I said. This company is not a throne. It is a responsibility. If anybody in this room ever confuses those two again, they'll be gone before the day is over. Nobody smiled. Nobody needed to, because they understood. And when the meeting ended, I walked out of that room not as a man desperate to hold on to power, but as the man who had survived his own son's betrayal and refused to become cruel in return. That, in the end, was the real inheritance. Not the shares. Not the company. Not the money. The ability to choose dignity over destruction. Sometimes people think karma is a lightning strike. They imagine dramatic collapse, public disgrace, tears, and instant justice. But real karma is usually quieter than that. It's Harold sitting alone in a courtroom while lawyers discuss his choices like inventory. It's Evan cleaning out a one-bedroom apartment after losing the life he thought he could steal. It's Claire rebuilding her peace one morning at a time. It's my grandson learning the difference between power and character. It's me, years after my own son tried to bury me, still standing. My son fired me from the family company and thought he had ended my story. He didn't know I owned 51% of the shares. But more than that, he didn't know I owned the truth. And once the truth finally came to light, it didn't just save the company. It saved what was left of my family. Not all of it. Maybe not ever all of it. But enough. And sometimes, after all the betrayal, enough is the closest thing to a miracle a man gets.